Well, hello everybody. It's a buy one get one free because we're about 2 minutes after the end of the last video, and I just thought I'd pause that one or stop that one, but then kind of crack straight on with another. Um, some of the earlier ones were getting to 40 minutes long, and it probably a bit of a stretch. So we did a 23-minute one on Hunter, Sydenham, surgery, public health. And we'll do another sort of 20-minute one or so on this. We'll look at medicines, and we'll look at hospitals, and then we've got another one which will come up later, which will start talking about the big guy himself, which is Edward Jenner. Okay, but right now we'll just have a little think about the Renaissance. We've talked already about, sort of what it was, what it meant, where it came from, what caused it. One of the great areas of change in the Renaissance was about exploration. If you were to look at a medieval map of the world made in the Middle Ages, you would probably find most medieval maps kind of had Jerusalem right in the center, and they were divided into kind of four quadrants, and you had kind of Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, with Jerusalem right in the middle. And around the outside was this huge encircling ocean, and you can talk about a flat world if you want, a disc world, or you can talk about a sphere. It doesn't really matter. The whole point was the world was all focused on Jerusalem as being kind of the center, the belly button of the world, if you like. And there was no, if you get a map like that and you look at it, you sort of, you might kind of say, well, what's off the edge? But you'd say it doesn't really matter because everything's balanced around this one place. And as we know, the medieval mind was very much sort of focused on, well, all the answers that you need to everything are in the Bible, and any question that isn't answered in the Bible is not a question worth asking. Obviously, they knew that there are questions that aren't answered in the Bible, but if they were important, God would have told us the answer in the Bible. And in the same way, everything points at Jerusalem and the story of Jesus. And you can ask, well, what's off the edge of the map? But it doesn't really matter because it's not pointing at Jerusalem. It's not part of this pattern that God has created. So it's not a question worth asking. But during the Renaissance, we know that questions are absolutely central to the Renaissance. And the explanation that the world is, that all the questions are answered in the Bible, or everything points at Jerusalem, is not an explanation that would have, satisfied people in the Renaissance, because the power of the church has declined, because the church is fighting among itself. The power of the church has declined because of the rediscovery of the scientific method and the rediscovery of exploration and asking questions and looking and observing the world. And so, therefore, when people are saying, well, what's off the edge of the world? What's off the edge of the map? What's over there? The old answers don't satisfy them anymore. So we get the development of far more exploration. At the same time, if you think about it, we talked about the feudal system, which fell apart after the plague. That feudal system had held everybody in the layer that they were in the triangle, hadn't it? It kind of capped them. They couldn't move up or down. So there's no point in somebody becoming richer, because even if you become richer, you have more wealth, you can't actually buy land with that wealth. You can't make decisions or choices about your life with that money, because the choices are kind of governed by the feudal system. You can't move house without asking permission from your owner. You can't get married without asking permission from your owner. You don't have freedom, even if you had money. So during the Renaissance, during the Middle Ages, there isn't the compulsion for people to seek to trade and to find new goods and to go and explore the world. Obviously, by the time the Renaissance comes along, because of the breakdown of the feudal system and the change in people's attitudes towards, observation and scientific method, there is more compulsion for people to go out, explore, and build, wealth, and build kind of their, build an empire, if you like, or whatever you want to call it, around the world, because that can now give them choices. If you become richer, you can go and live in a town. You can escape the feudal system. You can make your own choices and expend your money, and so it becomes you get the rise of a middle class. And whereas the aristocracy in the feudal system owned the land and the peasants worked the land, there's no room for a middle class if it's all about land. But in the time of the Renaissance, it isn't all about land anymore. It's about money and wealth. Physically, it's about money. You get the rise of coinage and the first, banknotes and things during the Renaissance. Whereas in the Middle Ages, things were bartered, things were swapped, one for another. Now you get the rise of the ability to hold wealth in money and in banks, which begin in the Renaissance as well. So there's much more of a compulsion for people to go and explore and to develop out of being peasants based on the land into a kind of middle class. And I think we've talked about, the end result of that, not the end result, but one result of that being the English Civil War, which is fought between Cromwell, who represents the middle classes. They've got wealth. They've built up their wealth during the Elizabethan period, which is another one of our topics. They've built up their wealth during the reign of Henry VIII, and now they want to kind of express that wealth in political terms, but they can't kind of because the king still represents the aristocracy, and in the end, the Parliament, the middle classes, rise up in rebellion against the king, and there's a civil war and they kill him, etc., etc. Well, that whole process, is part of the development of a middle class. We see it in the Renaissance here. We'll also see it when we look at Elizabethan England as well, where you get the rise of the gentry, which is basically the middle class, and they want to prove their loyalty to Elizabeth, so she uses them to run the country, etc. But that whole process, that decline of the feudal system and the rise of a middle class, where are that middle class getting their money from? They're getting it from trade. Okay, the important thing about trade is that you buy things at a low price and you sell them at a high price. You do it the other way around, you don't make money. But one way of increasing the value of something is to take it from somewhere where it is quite abundant, there's a lot of it, and take it to somewhere where there isn't very much of it. And as if by magic, the transfer of something from a place where there's lots of it to a place where there's none of it, as if by magic, makes that thing more valuable. Okay, it's the whole principle of international trade. Okay, you take something you buy something somewhere where it's cheap because there's a lot of it, because that's where it's made or grown or whatever. You transport it halfway across the world to a place where it's not made or grown, and magically it's doubled in price or whatever it is. Okay, and that impetus to go out and explore and find things that are abundant or growing in other places and bring them to somewhere where they're not is the driving force behind Renaissance exploration. And that obviously has an impact on medicine, because some of those things that are being brought from faraway countries are being discovered there and brought back to England. And that process of taking them from where they're grown to where they're not grown increases their value if they're things that people want to buy. Okay, and this was a mechanism through which many people became middle class rather than being peasants like they had been before. A bit of investment, buying a ship, commissioning some sailors, sailing halfway around the world, taking the risk with your well-being and your safety. You might fail, but if you succeed, the riches are probably beyond your wildest dreams. Okay, and what that process does is it means that there's far more products coming into England than ever before, and many of those products are seen as being of medical value, and many of them were. So for instance, we've got here the rise of, say, the opium trade coming from China, coming from the Far East. Opium is heroin, which is a drug, obviously, which is still used in medicine now, but became more widely used for the first time, during the Renaissance period. It's actually an anesthetic. It's not a very reliable one, or wasn't, at least in the way it was used in the Renaissance. So it didn't really transform surgery, but you got the beginnings of it. It's kind of a pain relief. So some of the first pain relief, and that's been brought from around the world into England, and it's changing the nature of medicine in England. So although we had those people with their theories, and we said they didn't change very much, one thing that is really clear is that during the Renaissance there's far more new treatments, new ideas, and new ingredients coming into the country because of trade. Okay, and we can sort of think about some examples of that, like opium, which is one that would work, aspirin, which comes from the bark of a tree grown in, I think, South America, certainly a tree that's widely grown elsewhere, and you can bring that into the country, the bark itself, and grind it up and eat it, chew it, whatever, and it will relieve pain. So that's where we get our first aspirin from originally. So some of them had medical effects. Others that were brought in didn't actually have medical effects, but were seen to. They thought they did. We've mentioned before about when we were talking about apothecaries, how an apothecary would bring things in from other countries into England on a smaller scale than we see in the Renaissance, but during the Middle Ages some spices and things did come. And one of the thoughts was that if God had made this thing unusual in some way, it was part of the doctrine of signatures. It was a way in which God was giving us symbols, giving us hints that this thing was going to have kind of medical purposes. And this just accelerates in the Renaissance. So rhubarb, for example, really kind of quite a strong taste. Maybe God has kind of put rhubarb on planet Earth. It then can be brought to England to treat, illnesses. And, the reason it's useful is because it's got that unusual taste. Tobacco is another one. So, if you smoke tobacco, it does help with coughs in the short term because it puts it basically anesthetizes the hairs in your throat, and it will stop you coughing for a short period. So it was often prescribed by physicians as a medicine. Okay, and again, we're still, if you think about it, still in that time when we're talking about herbal remedies. I think, as I've said before, everything that humans have around us, it all comes from the earth in the end. It's either mineral or plant-based or animal-based. And here we've got herbal remedies that are being brought into England. So things like tobacco, things like bark from trees, cinchona bark, for example, opium, rhubarb, some of them working, some of them not. And because of the kind of difficulty of knowing what works and what doesn't, we've got the rise of something we might call quack medicine or quackery. So a quack is an unlicensed doctor, somebody who is, selling remedies, particularly during the Renaissance, that are kind of, taking advantage of the fact that the government are not that involved in regulation. I know we mentioned about the Royal College of Physicians and the Royal College of Surgeons, but, it's not like now where, there's stringent food safety standards and, certain drugs are illegal and, other medicines are licensed after testing and things. None of that is taking place. So these people who are quacks, or quack doctors, are basically inventing and selling medicines, and there's a very shaky kind of process of creating those medicines, perhaps with some idea that there's been some scientific method, but not of the kind of very academically focused scientific method that's quite stringent and that gets to the bottom of things that we know. Instead, maybe, I tried this out on a few people and it kind of worked. And these quack medicines, over time, they actually kind of become sort of more overblown in their claims rather than going in the other direction. And again, it's because there's a lack of kind of control as to what can be sold. And, if you're a business person, you've got two possible kind of ways of selling your quack medicine. You could say, it'll solve this problem and this problem, but it won't do anything for these others, and you'll get fewer customers. Or you might say, it'll solve every problem, and then you'll get more people buying it. And because of a lack of kind of government regulation, people could make these claims. They could claim more and more things could be cured by their particular medicine, and you get the development of kind of these potions that have unusual ingredients in, things like rhubarb and opium and things, that are mixed up in kind of, not really made in what we would think of as scientific conditions. And then the claims are like massive. This is kind of this is the cure to all ailments. This particular thing that I'm selling you it's like the water of life. It's gonna make you young forever, blah blah blah. And you just make more and more extreme claims for it, because by the time anybody comes back and tells you it didn't work, you could say, oh well, you didn't take enough of it, that's why it didn't work, or you took it on a Tuesday and you should have taken it on a Wednesday, or whatever it might be. Or you might even have just left town. It's like this quack doctor here. You sell your stuff and then you bog off pretty quick before anybody can get back to you. So these people would travel around the country selling these potions. Some of them had some ingredients that might work, say opium. It certainly make you feel sort of unusual. Oh, this is definitely working, but whether it would actually cure any of your ailments is pretty unlikely. Obviously, alcohol was used quite a lot, fairly strong alcohol. Anything that, seemed like it might be a medicine. Aniseed, for example, tastes really strong. Licorice root tastes really strong. Mercury, it's the only metal that's liquid at room temperature, so it's obviously unusual. Put some of that in. Opium, let's put some of that in. Let's take some spices from the Far East or the Middle East. They must be important because they're spices. God must have. And we'll put them all in together, mix it all up, and we'll sell it as being the cure to everything. And because there's no licensing, we're actually there just to make some money. Basically, we will claim it'll solve anything, sell a load of it, and move off to the next town. And this seems like medicine, but it's not really medicine. It's an attempt by a society that doesn't really know what's causing disease to come up with some answers for what's causing it. Okay, in a time when there's so many more ingredients coming into the country. Whilst those ingredients coming in, a couple more people to kind of mention up here, which is Lady Joanna St. John. She's a good example of the continuation of the Lady of the House. She was a lady of the manor, and she would treat the workers on the manor farms. She would treat the villagers. She'd treat members of her family. And she kept a book of cures, a recipe book, just like we said before, the Lady of the House would have cures for different ailments that members of the family and workers would have. So very much, in the same way that you had the Lady of the House providing healthcare during the Middle Ages, that kind of continues into the Renaissance. The one difference with Lady Joanna is that because you've got better communication in the Renaissance, you've got the development of more transport, more travel, as we've said, more trade. That gives an impetus to better roads being made and, it being easier to travel around the country. So Lady Joanna is in communication. I think the first postal service developed in the Renaissance. She's in communication with people from London who are getting these ingredients in from around the world. And it may not be just like it was the Lady of the House getting things from her local environment. Now you've got her buying ingredients in from the rest of the country. And as things become, developed and become more complicated, you get the need for more complicated sort of written works about the use of herbal remedies. And the most famous one of those is Nicholas Culpeper. And Culpeper wrote The Complete Herbal in 1653. I have a copy of it somewhere. No, this isn't. I don't think this is Culpeper's. I've got Gerard's Herbal. Let's see when this was written. 1597. So there's a herbal book from the Renaissance, and Gerard is writing about mandrake here. He's writing about wandberry, true love. He's got some drawings so you can recognise the herbs. Of the history. Do you want to check out the spelling of the history of plants? people in the Renaissance did not spell properly. That's something that was invented in the Victorian period, spelling. I don't know if I've got Culpeppers. Give me one sec. It might be round the corner. I'll see if I can find Culpeppers. Back in a tick. Here it is. Culpeper's Complete Herbal and English Physician, published in the Renaissance. Okay. Now, again, without the printing press and the development of the printing press, Culpeper wouldn't have been able to write this. And without more trade bringing foods, remedies, herbs into the country, he wouldn't be able to. He wouldn't be able to have there wouldn't be as much to write about. So that's kind of an example of the development of herbal remedies during the Renaissance. And it's absolutely true that some of these herbal remedies have ended up going on to become the treatments and the medicines that we still use today. Maybe the chemicals are now synthesized and they're made scientifically rather than grown, but basically we've got the beginnings there of a more sort of scientific understanding of herbal remedies, and that's necessary because there's so many more ingredients coming into England, okay, during the Renaissance. Okay, the last thing just to talk about, or one more thing to talk about with the Renaissance before we later on have another video about Jenna, is about changes in hospitals. We talked about hospitals in the Middle Ages, but we said they were run by the church, often attached to monasteries. And if you know anything about Henry VIII, you'll know that he had 6 wives, and in order to get rid of his first wife, in the end he had to create the Church of England and put himself in charge of the church, and that is known as the Reformation. And as part of that process, because it wasn't just about religion, it was also about land ownership and wealth, Henry seized the land of the monasteries and he closed down the monasteries of England because, well, he wanted their wealth mostly, but also they followed the Pope. And so the provision of healthcare and the running of hospitals fell away from the church because, the Catholic Church wasn't important in England anymore. It was illegal, in fact. So we had a Church of England and the monasteries weren't there. And so hospitals are no longer being run by the church. However, we do get the rise of people who are leaving their wealth to hospitals in order to, provide for the poor. And they become more like a charity rather than things being run by the church or government. Instead, hospitals become sort of charity hospitals, and they begin to become specialised as well. So some hospitals become children's hospitals. So we've got the development of those. We've got foundling hospitals for children who are born and then abandoned by their parents. And a lot of these are kind of funded by voluntary donations, so they can be called voluntary hospitals as well. And they tend to be provided money in people's inheritance, in people's wills, as sort of part of the process of people, I suppose, wanting to be remembered after their death as somebody who cared for the sick or cared for the poor, and that kind of somebody being seen as a philanthropist or someone who gives money to charity and to poor people. And because these hospitals are now no longer linked with the church, they can, instead of focusing on pilgrimage and looking after people who are, travellers basically, instead hospitals can begin to as I say, specialise, and they specialise on looking after the sick, looking after poor people, and looking after people who need medical help rather than just, because they're on pilgrimage and those kind of things. Okay, so that's an important development in hospitals. It doesn't do enough, And that's why poverty becomes such a big problem in Elizabethan England. And you get the development of the Poor Law, which leads on to workhouses. You know, as you'll know if you study Elizabethan England for this exam board. You know, poverty is a big problem for Elizabeth because of the decline of the monasteries, which used to provide kind of care for the poor. And the hospitals don't necessarily fill that gap completely, but where hospitals survive, they are no longer linked with pilgrimage, and instead they're sort of more free to develop medical care and medical treatments. Okay, so in terms of the Renaissance, which we've kind of got to the end of now, we've got this kind of curious divide between you know, new ideas and new developments, Harvey, Paré, Vesalius, and you know, not really those great medical or theoretical discoveries leading to change at the ground level. But we've got a professionalisation of surgery and the beginnings of the government licensing of surgeons and the use of apprenticeships, but not really government intervention in keeping people healthy in the way that we might have thought. We've got new treatments and new ingredients coming in, but it's not licensed enough. We've got the decline of hospitals, but those that survive can become more medically focused. So in each case, there's kind of an up and a down. There's, you know, new ideas, but it's not new treatments. There's more professional surgery, but things aren't really changing in terms of what they're doing. There's new ingredients, but not, you know, but it's not licensed, so you get quack medicine. We've got better hospitals, but there's not so many of them. We've got more government regulation of Royal College of Surgeons, but they're not really intervening to make cities healthy. So it's a real mixed bag in terms of people's everyday experience of medicine in the Renaissance. It's not that different. It's going to take, you know, time for these changes to trickle through. One of the more difficult questions on the exam, actually, you know, it has this idea that what are the similarities between time periods? And, you know, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to kind of think of those similarities. We kind of have, you know, this changed, that changed, then this came along and changed. But Renaissance in these areas is a really good example of how, you know, you can have new changes at one level, but it takes time, you know, hundreds of years in some cases, for those changes to become embedded and for ordinary people to benefit from those things. And Renaissance is a good example of that in all of those areas. Okay, now when we came onto this second time period, I did explain that, you know, Renaissance, early modern Britain are pushed together, and most of what we've been talking about so far, apart from maybe some of the Royal College of Surgeons stuff, is mostly Renaissance. But the next thing we're going to look at next time we have a video is the development of the smallpox vaccine by Edward Jenner, and that's firmly in the early modern Britain part of this time period that has two real time periods squashed together into it. So we're going to leave smallpox for now, but there'll be another video about Edward Jenner and the development of smallpox pretty soon. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.